In Genesis 9, we have the account of what God said to Noah after the flood. The flood has come and gone, the waters have risen and subsided, the ark has come to rest, and Noah and his family have disembarked from the ark, and God was now establishing his new covenant with Noah. And the first thing God wanted to set straight with these 8 people was their most intimate relationships. Genesis 9, starting in verse 1, Then God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. Now this was the first commandment that God gives to Noah and his family, and it's exactly the same as the first commandment that he gave to Adam and Eve in the garden. And the significance of that for today's lesson lies in the fact that what God is commanding here is intimacy. As the author of Genesis says in Genesis 2:24, For this reason shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. It isn't just that God wanted Adam and Eve and then Noah's sons and their wives to populate the earth, though that is clearly one of the things that he wants. But also, more importantly for today's lesson, the intimacy that God commanded in verse 1 of Genesis 9 was evocative of the intimacy that God forbade in verses 2 through 5 of Genesis 9. Because through the intimacy of marital relations, a man and a woman become one. They become one in body, and they become one in spirit. Now that's why, for instance, a woman cannot be compelled in a court of law to testify against her husband, and vice versa. It isn't just because a married couple is one legal entity and both parties share the same interests. It's also because, going back for many centuries, the law, which was written by learned Christians, has recognized that, spiritually speaking, husband and wife are one person. Because the union of consummation consists of more than merely the commingling of bodies, but the commingling of spirits as well. And when 2 people are joined in holy wedlock, they become one. Because in that union, their spirits become so intermingled that it becomes impossible to tell where one person starts and the other leaves off. In fact, these personal distinctions become so blurred that Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7:4, the wife does not have authority over her own body, but her husband does. And likewise, also, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Because your participation in the being of your spouse is so thoroughgoing that the very essence, the very life of the one person becomes part of the very life of the other. And that is instructive for understanding what God says next. Because here in Genesis 9, just as in Genesis 2, the very next thing God addresses after addressing bodily intimacy with one's spouse is bodily intimacy with one's food. Now that may sound like an odd characterization, but it isn't. In Genesis 2, God's command was that the diet of every creature on earth, every person and animal, was to consist of the produce of the earth. Genesis 2:29 through 30. Then, by way of witness, God said, I grant you to eat the produce of every seed-bearing plant and tree on the face of the earth. These are given for your sustenance. Thus every animal on earth, every bird of the air, every sort of wildlife and creeping thing on earth is to sustain its life entirely by eating the produce of green plants. So in the beginning, the diet of every animal, including that of human beings, was to be completely vegetarian. But then in Genesis 9, after the flood, God modified that command and allowed that, in addition to eating plants, human beings were from that point forward to eat meat as well. Genesis 9, starting in verse 2, The fear and dread of you will fall on all the beasts of the earth, and on all the birds in the sky, on every creature that moves along the ground, and on all the fish in the sea. All these are given into your hands. Everything that lives and moves about will be food for you. Just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you everything. Apparently, before the flood, the animals weren't afraid of people. That didn't happen till after the flood. And the fear that animals have of humankind is God ordained. Now, I don't know if you've seen any of these documentaries on TV, any of these reality shows featuring people who try to keep wild animals as pets, only to find out that wild animals are wild. And that it's all but inevitable that at some point that animal's wild nature is going to come out. Now, most of these pet owners are operating under the mistaken illusion that the reason why animals are afraid of people is because people have been cruel to them. But that they, and they alone, have the power, through showing consistent love and kindness, to overcome that enmity. That everyone else who tried and failed, well, those people, they didn't know what they were doing. They just weren't loving enough, or zen enough, or empathetic enough, or patient enough, or in tune with nature enough. And then they're always surprised to find out that they don't have the power within themselves to overturn God's ordinance, that there would be an inherent enmity between animals and humankind. Well, that enmity is God ordained. And that goes to what God says next. Genesis 9:4, but you must not eat meat that has its lifeblood still in it. And why does God forbid his people to eat meat with lifeblood in it? Leviticus 17:11, for the life of the flesh is in the blood. And that word life there is nephesh or nephesh, the same word that's used in the Old Testament for spirit. It refers to the spirit of a living creature, the breath of life breathed into a living creature. Here, the Darby translation reads, for the soul of the flesh is in the blood. Now, that's a misuse of the word soul, because the word soul is not a synonym for the word spirit, at least when it comes to human beings, because a soul is a whole human being, body and spirit, and Darby should have known that. Nevertheless, I give him credit for capturing the general sense here in Leviticus 17, because the rationale that God gives here is clear and unmistakable. Why does God forbid the eating of meat with blood still in it? Because life is in the blood. And if you take the blood of another living creature into your body, you take the spirit of that creature into your body. And doing so puts you into an intimate relationship with that animal. That is, if you eat meat with blood still in it, the spirit of that animal will enter into your body and commingle with your spirit. The two of you will become one. But God says you don't want to be one with an animal, because the spirits of animals are, by God's own ordinance, innately hostile to human beings. And taking the life of an animal into your body is not only self-destructive, but it is an insult to God, in whose very image you were made. And here I just want to be clear about this, just as clear as I can be. About 50 years ago, two medical doctors, Sim McMillan and David Stern, wrote a book entitled None of These Diseases, in which they purport to explain the dietary restrictions that God set forth in the Old Testament in terms of their health effects. And I can't tell you how many times people have recommended this book to me as a means of better understanding the dietary laws that God put forth in the law of Moses. Well, I don't deny that God has our best interest in mind, and it doesn't surprise me at all to learn that the diet God sets forth for his people in the law of Moses turns out to be a healthy one. But God tells us why he gives the dietary restrictions that he gives in the Old Testament, at least as far as Genesis 9 is concerned. His rationales have nothing to do with avoiding blood-borne diseases. God doesn't say you shall not eat meat with blood in it, because if you do, you might get E. coli or salmonella or norovirus or hepatitis or listeria or trichinosis. God says you shall not eat meat with blood still in it, because life is in the blood. And eating the flesh and drinking the blood of a living being will cause that life, that spirit, to enter into your body, granting it intimacy with your spirit. And that, God says, is an abomination. Now, God says that's bad enough when that which you take into yourself is the life of an animal. But if that which you take into yourself is the life of a human being, then you're going to have to stand toe-to-toe with me and explain that to me. That's what he goes on to say in the verses that follow. Now, most commentators there say that what's in view in Genesis 9:5 is murder, plain and simple. That what God says there is that it's okay to spill the blood of an animal, but it's not okay to spill the blood of a human being, because human beings are made in the image of God. Now, that is a fact. Clearly, Genesis 9 prohibits murder. And that's made clear by what God says in Genesis 9:6, which where he appears to mandate capital punishment for the crime of murder. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed, for in the image of God has God made humankind. However, this is not a judicial passage. This is not a protocol for the administration of justice in a court of law in a civil society. The context here is not one of criminal law. Rather, the context here is deeply personal. At this point in the book of Genesis, if you take the account of the flood literally, there are only 8 people on earth. And they all know each other really well. They've all been cooped up together, living and working together in extremely close quarters for well over a year. This is not an abstract legal theory or an abstract legal principle. The context here is one of spiritual and physical intimacy stemming from conjugal relations. First, in terms of that which one is to be conjoined through marital intimacy. That's where he starts in Genesis 9:1, and that's where he ends in Genesis 9:7. The command to draw life out of your own bodies through intimacy in order to place it in another by procreation. And second, in terms of that with which one is conjoined through consumption, through eating and drinking. And to this question, God says, do allow yourself to be conjoined to the life of your spouse by consummating your marriage bed, thereby to create new life out of your own being, but do not allow yourself to be conjoined to the life of an animal by consuming its flesh and drinking its blood, thereby to draw its life into your being and make it part of yourself. And by all means, do not allow yourself to be conjoined to the life of another human being by eating human flesh or drinking human blood. And do not offer your own flesh and blood to anyone else for them to consume. Genesis 9:5, and for your lifeblood I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting from every animal and from each human being too. I will demand an accounting for the life of another human being. Beloved, what God articulates here in Genesis 9 isn't put forth merely for jurisprudential purposes. Yes, the judicial mandate is both present and patent, but don't miss the human context and the inescapable ontological reality that accompanies it. Because what God says in Genesis 9 isn't theoretical. It is graphic, vivid, explicit, intimate, and personal. And it goes to the most deep-seated, the basest, the rawest, the most primitive, and the most savage of human instincts. The instinct to spill seed and thereby to create life from our own beings, and the instinct to spill blood and thereby to consume life, taking it into our own beings. And that, beloved, sheds a great deal of light on what Jesus says to his disciples in John 6. Because in John 6, Jesus affirms everything that God says in Genesis 9. Jesus affirms in John 6 that yes, indeed, if you eat flesh with lifeblood still in it, then the life that you eat becomes part of you. And you enter into an intimate relationship with the life of the one, with the life of the one whose flesh you have eaten and of whose blood you have drunken. John 6, starting in verse 53, Jesus said to them, "Very truly I tell you, unless you eat of the flesh of the Son of Man and drink of his blood, you have no life in you. Whoever eats of my flesh and drinks of my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up at the last day. For my flesh is real food, and my blood is real drink. Whosoever eats of my flesh and drinks of my blood remains in me, and I in him." Now, what Jesus does here is that he testifies to a truth. This isn't some super spiritual concept or some super philosophical idea. This is as earthy and as visceral and as real as it gets. Life is in the blood. And anyone who eats flesh with lifeblood still in it takes that life into himself or herself. That is a spiritual reality, and that is a physical reality. There too, Jesus says, anyone who eats my flesh and drinks my blood will have my life in them. And that isn't a sentimental notion. That isn't a badly written, poorly conceived Hallmark card that says no one can ever take your loved one from you because they'll always live in your heart. They'll always be in your memories. No. What Jesus is saying in John 6 is, if you take my flesh and blood into your body, you are taking my life, my spirit, into your body. And when I get there, I will establish intimacy with your spirit, which also dwells in your body. Thus, both of the images set forth in Genesis 6, both senses of conjugal intimacy are at work in this passage. Life is in the blood. Your life, your spirit resides in your blood, in your cardia. And when you take the blood of Christ into your body, you take his life, his spirit into your body, where it will cohabitate with your spirit. As he goes on in verse 57 of John 6 to say, just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so the one who feeds on me will live because of me. And that brings us to where we left off last week. Because last week we ended with a question left unanswered. Because what Jesus says in John 6 doesn't take place in a vacuum. It has a context. And Jesus doesn't simply present himself to us in John 6 that we might eat of his flesh and drink of his blood. Rather, he presents himself as the bread of life. That is, he introduces a degree of metaphor into the discourse. And in so doing, he hints at the feast and ritual he will introduce a year or so later at the Last Supper, where in Matthew 26, Mark 14, and Luke 22, it says that Jesus took bread, broke it, and said, "This is my body broken for you. And likewise he took the cup of wine and said, This is my blood shed for you. And that begs the question, to what degree is the Lord's Supper, as we encounter it, symbolic of the body and blood of Christ, and to what degree can it be said that the elements of the Lord's Supper are more than symbolic? Because obviously when Jesus presents the bread to us as his body and the wine as his blood, he introduces a degree of metaphor into the sacred feast. At least that seems to be obvious to us, though neither Jesus nor any biblical author ever uses the language of symbolism in regard to the elements of the Lord's Supper. When Jesus introduced the Lord's Supper, the words that he chose seem to be quite deliberate. And they've been the source of no small degree of controversy within the church ever since. The words that are recorded seem to be the exact words of Jesus. Now, most of the time in the gospel accounts, when a given incident is reported by more than one gospel author, we find that there's a degree of variation between the accounts. For instance, as Matthew, Mark, and Luke report the feeding of the 5,000, there's a degree of variation between the three reports in regard to the instructions Jesus gave as to the way that the crowds were to be arranged for the meal they were about to receive. In Matthew 4:19 it says, and he directed the people to sit down on the grass. In Mark 6:39 it says, and he commanded them all, he commanded them to make all sit down by companies upon the green grass. And in Luke 9:14, Luke quotes Jesus saying, he said, make them sit down by 50s in a company. Now, just to be clear, these variations do not present contradictions. In order for there to be a contradiction, the statements would have to be mutually irreconcilable, and they're not. Rather, they're complementary. And as most historians read these accounts, the variations tend to validate the truth of the accounts. That's the kind of thing you look for when you're trying to ascertain the truth or the accuracy of a given report, is a degree of perspective brought to the account by the observer or by the reporter. Now, when you look at the gospel accounts of the institution of the Last Supper, you find the same kinds of variations, the same sort of perspective brought to each of the individual accounts. However, in all three gospel accounts of the first Lord's Supper, there's one four-word phrase that remains constant across the board with no variation. Matthew 26:26, Mark 14:22, and Luke 22:19. When Jesus broke the bread and gave it to his disciples with instructions for them to eat it, all three of these historians place the exact same four words on the lips of Jesus. This is my body. And these four words are retained in the report that Paul received and that he passes on in 1 Corinthians 11:24. According to Paul, what Jesus said when he broke the bread and gave it to the disciples to eat was, "This is my body." He did not say this represents my body. He did not say this symbolizes my body. And nowhere in the whole New Testament does any author ever say the Lord's Supper as we receive it is symbolic. And that isn't for lack of vocabulary or lack of an understanding of symbols or what symbols are or what they're for or how they're used. Jesus spoke constantly in parables, and a parable is the epitome of what an analogy is. The word parable from the Greek word parabole means to throw alongside. A parable is an illustration that runs alongside or that runs parallel to the reality to which it points. And the New Testament uses at least 6 words to talk about things that are representative. Eikon, which is translated likeness. Homioma, which is translated made like to, similitude, or in the shape of. Homeosis, which is translated likeness or similitude. Tupos, which is translated ensample, print, figure, example, pattern, fashion, manner, and form. Skia, which is translated shadow, as in types and shadows of things to come. Hupodegma, which is translated example, ensample, and pattern. Yet, with all this wealth of vocabulary to talk about types, symbols, and emblems, and with the apparent ease and frequency with which these words were used, no New Testament author ever uses any of these words in reference to the Lord's Supper. Rather, they allow Christ's own description of the elements of the Lord's Supper to stand on its own. Jesus said, "Of the bread, this is my body, and of the cup, this is my blood," which can only mean one of 2 things. Either it seemed so obvious to all the gospel writers and to Paul and to the other apostles that Jesus intended for us to understand the Lord's Supper in purely metaphorical terms that they didn't see any need to say so. Or there is some sense in which the bread, as we encounter it, is the body of Christ, and some sense in which the wine, as we encounter it, is the blood of Christ. Now, historically, people have taken a couple of approaches to try to answer that question, both of which have relied on pure reason to fill in the gap between what the Bible affirms and what we can observe, and both of which ultimately fail to answer the question completely, at least to my satisfaction. And those 2 approaches are as follows: to rely on empirical observation, or to rely on the scientific thinking of Aristotle. Now, the first approach, to rely on empirical observation, that's the approach that we usually take in our tradition. We look at the elements and we say, well, obviously, these elements, holy though they may be, sanctified though they may be, are not literally the body and blood of Christ. So clearly, he meant for us to understand them symbolically, metaphorically. The second approach, to rely on the scientific thinking of Aristotle, that's the approach that's taken by the Roman Catholic Church. Now, I don't have time in this lesson to go into the details, but the thumbnail version of the teaching of the Catholic Church on this matter is that everything has 2 constituents to its makeup: its substance and its accidents. The substance of a thing is its true nature, its whatness, its thingness. The accidents of a thing are its observable attributes. And according to Catholic doctrine, the elements of the Lord's Supper retain the accidents of bread and wine, but when they are blessed by the priest, they take on the substance of the body and blood of Christ. Now, the problem with both of these approaches, as I see it, is that neither one of these approaches takes into account the little bit that the Bible does offer in the way of answering the question of the degree to which Jesus' words, "This is my body, this is my blood," may point to a spiritual reality. The question of the degree to which the elements of the Lord's Supper may be more than merely symbolic, because the Bible does tell us something that goes some distance toward answering this question. After all, what is the rationale that God gives in Genesis 9 for his prohibition against eating flesh with blood still in it. Life is in the blood. And if you eat the flesh and drink the blood with life in it, you take that life into yourself, into your body, into your blood. And what is the rationale that Christ gives in John 6 for eating his flesh and drinking his blood? Life is in the blood. And if you eat of the flesh of Christ and drink of his blood, you will have his life in you, in your body, in your blood. And what is it that Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11 actually happens to those who eat and drink of the elements of the Lord's Supper? We receive the life of Christ into our bodies. Or at least that's the implication. 1 Corinthians 11, starting in verse 26, "For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. So then whoever eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of sinning against the body and blood of the Lord. Everyone ought to examine themselves before they eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For those who eat and drink without discerning the body of Christ eat and drink judgment on themselves. That is why many among you are weak and sick, and a number of you have fallen asleep." Now this is remarkable to me, because what Paul says here is that those who partake of the elements of the Lord's Supper in an unworthy manner suffer consequences for doing that. Real life consequences, real spiritual consequences, and real physical consequences. And what are those consequences? Sickness and death. Physical sickness, physical death. In other words, the elements of the Lord's Supper, the bread and the wine as we encounter them, have the power of life and death in them. And that isn't a metaphor. If the bread that we eat and the fruit of the vine that we drink when we take the Lord's Supper were merely emblems of the body and blood of Christ, they would not have power to affect those who partake of them the way that Paul says they in fact affect us. If Paul is right that eating this bread and drinking this cup without discerning the body of the Lord can result in physical sickness or physical death, and if Jesus is right, if eating this bread and drinking this cup bring about the actual result that Jesus promises in John 6, that so partaking will actually cause the life of Christ to be made manifest in us, in our bodies, and in our spirits. And if God is right, that eating this bread and drinking this cup will bring us into intimacy with Christ in the very way that God says eating flesh with lifeblood still in it brings us into intimacy with the life we consume, then it seems to me that it must be that the bread and the wine are more than merely symbolic. Now, what do I mean by that? In what way are the elements of the Lord's Supper more than symbols? In what sense is the life of Christ actually present in the bread and wine as we encounter them in the Lord's Supper? And how does it come to be that that is so? Come back next week and I'll tell you. That's my lesson for today. Let's sing. Number 420.